Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be there with you this morning or this afternoon because of the virus which is spreading throughout the world. But let me share with you my ideas on language teaching. As I have been working as a social linguist for many years, and from conversations and data obtained through listening to people, talking to people, I have realized that there are a number of things, information, knowledge that we can use from social linguistics in language teaching. And I would like to talk to you about three aspects, three ideas which can be shared in the language classroom and which have been obtained from social linguistic data. Number one, I want to talk about speech acts and cultural identity. As you know, today we have many types of Englishes being used. We have Singapore English, we have Malaysian English, and of course we have the native speakers' notion of English. Even then that varies between British English, American English, and Australian English. What I have noticed from social linguistic data is that people tend to use a lot of their cultural norms in the Englishes they use. So their identity, their ethnic identity, their cultural norms, their values come across in the language they use, especially for speech acts. Let me give you a bit of history and past research work. Identity and classroom pedagogies have inspired much research from scholars in different contexts. Lee's 2008 findings on post-secondary institutions in Canada suggested that there's often a disjuncture between the pedagogies conceptualized by the teachers and their actual classroom practices. Various other researchers have worked on the same theme, identifying identity-related questions in classroom pedagogies, and have suggested transformative strategies to expand identities. Clementi and Higgins, again in 2008, drew on their longitudinal study of pre-service English teachers in Mexico to question the dominant role of English in the globalized economy, and illustrated the ways in which the non-native English teachers sought to appropriate and illustrate the ways in which local identities could be shown but were being sacrificed. Cummins in 2000 presented case studies of 3 schools in the United States, Belgium, and New Zealand that have made a positive difference in the lives of bilingual, bicultural children by affirming in every facet of the school operation the value of children's languages and their cultures. The notion of identity versus language learning is in accord with post-structuralist, sociocultural, and critical theories that conceive of language not only as a linguistic system, but also as a social practice. I want to move on to cultural norms. Being fluent in English does not mean that we are abandoning our identity or our traditions. Instead, by mastering the English language, we are able to compete in the fast-paced global economy, but still preserving our culture and values. We can use the English language to communicate about our culture, customs, and knowledge with the rest of the world. Proficiency in our own language is therefore also highly important because being bilingual or multilingual will build our confidence to speak to people from different racial backgrounds. Let me give you some examples of research. Hino in 2018 promotes the use of Japanese English. He refers back to Kachuru's expanding circle context by providing concrete suggestions for practitioners. He developed an original model of Japanese English, investigating how Japanese values could be demonstrated in Japanese English. An example of this is to create textbooks that teach how okakisamadi, an expression of modesty to soften a compliment, could be used. For instance, if someone says, and I quote, "It's good you are back from Tokyo," instead of saying thank you, it would express the moral aspect of Japanese culture to say, "With your kind influence, I am safely back." Sociolinguists and anthropologists have therefore long recognized that the forms and uses of a given language reflect the cultural values of the society in which the language is spoken. Language learners need to be aware, for example, of the culturally appropriate ways to address people, express gratitude, make requests, and agree or disagree when using English with fellow countrymen or even with others for whom English is not a first language. These are known as speech acts. A speech act is basically an utterance that has a function in communication. We perform speech acts when we offer an apology, give a greeting, make a request, make a complaint, invite someone, compliment someone, or make a refusal. A speech act might contain just one word, as in sorry, to perform an apology, or several words or sentences, and I quote, "I'm sorry I forgot your birthday. I just let it slip my mind." As speech acts include real-life interaction, they require not only knowledge of the language, but also appropriate use of that language within a given culture. They also require the knowledge of the relationship between speaker and listener and the context in which the speech act is realized. A lot of research has been done on speech acts, especially on speech acts using cultural norms. Elwood in 2005 compared the speech act of congratulations by American and Japanese subjects. The results showed there were differences even by those Japanese students writing in English. As for condolences, Alami and Smawachi in 2012, in their study of condolences, found that Persian speakers and EFL learners are more direct than native speakers of English. In my own research on condolences, I also noticed that depending on their religion, Malaysians would give condolences in different ways, even though they were using English. So Malaysian Muslim speakers, native speakers of Malay, would give their condolences in English in a different way as compared to Chinese Buddhist speakers of English, as compared to Indian speakers, because based on their cultural norms, what they said, even though it was said in English, reflected their religious beliefs and their cultural norms. So let's move on to the pedagogical implications of speech acts and cultural norms. Interactions obtained from literary sources and real-time interactions obtained from social media present a wide variety of the realization of many speech acts. The enactment or realization of a response when we give compliments, condolences, or for that matter, any speech act like greetings, responses to compliments, refusals, they all depend on our relationship with the interlocutor and on our religious and cultural norms and that of the recipient. Using examples from real-time interactions or from literary sources or even social media, the teacher can sensitize learners to both relationships between speaker and listener and religious and cultural norms of both parties. Communicatively competent learners will result from such a teaching approach. Through this approach, it is hoped that language learners will change their conversational styles depending on whether English is used intranationally or internationally, with ASEAN speakers using English or with native speakers of English. We use language to communicate. Language teachers must bear this in mind and not only focus on syntax. What we say and how we say it depends on the context and our speech partner or interlocutor. This is because real-life acts of speech usually involve interpersonal relations of some kind. I do not deny that behaviors and intonation patterns that are appropriate in their own speech community may be perceived differently by members of the target language speech community. Therefore, learners have to be made to understand that in order for communication to be successful, learners' language use must be associated with culturally appropriate behavior when using English with fellow countrymen and when using English with native speakers of English. Language learning is not only a linguistic system, but also a social and cultural practice where local and cultural norms and identities are represented. I would now like to move on to the second thing that I learned when conducting sociolinguistic research. When speakers are not proficient in a language, in order to communicate, they use communicative strategies. Language teaching involves not only passing on new knowledge, but also making learners conscious of their innate abilities and known knowledge. For instance, every learner is capable of executing communicative strategies, but they may not be able to use the appropriate strategy spontaneously. A practical and economical way to develop learners' communicative competence is to increase their strategic competence, i.e., their ability to use communicative strategies to cope with various communication problems they may encounter. Selinka, way back in 1972, first used the term communicative strategy to refer to one of the processes that is responsible for producing interlanguage errors. Selinka defined communicative strategy, and I quote, as an identifiable approach by the learner to communicate with native speakers. In this paper, communicative strategies are viewed as attempts made by inventive language learners to circumvent their linguistic difficulties or inadequacies in order to transmit messages or communicate with the listener or interlocutor. Such strategies are generally used when the limited knowledge of learners makes it difficult for them to express their intended message. Terone, in 1981, describes communicative strategies, and I quote, as a systematic attempt by the learner to express and decode meanings in the target language in situations where the appropriate systematic target language used have not been found or have not been formed. Communicative strategies therefore serve to compensate for the inadequacies of speakers and listeners in the target language which is being used. Lim and David, 1995, made a case for the inclusion of communicative strategies as a teaching tool for ESL teacher trainees. David, in 1992, investigated the possibility of consciousness raising of communicative strategies as a tool to improve language proficiencies of L2 learners. If by teaching through example and practice, we can make learners more aware of the communicative problems they might encounter in communication and the importance and advantage of using different types of communicative strategies to cope with different problems, they might be able to choose more appropriate communication strategies and use them more consciously in this light. Using a group of language learners in the University of Malaya, I argue for the inclusion of consciousness raising of communicative strategies in a language teaching syllabus. Pedagogical implications, communicative strategies. Sherwood Smith, 1981, argues, and I quote, "There is no reason to assume that consciousness raising by the teacher and conscious learning by the learner cannot be investigated in a systematic way." In an exploratory research paper entitled Consciousness Raising of Communicative Strategies, a Springboard to Language Proficiency, I argue that if through a consciousness awareness phase, learners are made aware of the strategies already available to them, this could be a springboard to self-esteem and language proficiency. Even at the lexical level, language learners can be taught to make use of a wide range of strategies to get meaning across. Such strategies include inter alia circumlocution, simplification, approximation, appeal for assistance, gestures, the use of formulaic expressions, rephrasing, and many others. I now would like to move on to the third aspect that I obtained from my data on social linguistic data, and this is the schema theory. As a social linguist, I noted sometimes there was a lack of understanding of a message as the speaker used words, an idea, or a concept which was not understood by the listener. This now takes me to the schema theory. The schema theory postulates that in order to facilitate reading and comprehension on the part of learners, the language teacher should carefully select texts which are familiar. In this way, links can be made with known knowledge or existing schemas. Such links facilitate understanding and learning. Schema theory is based on the belief that, and I quote Anderson et al., 1977, open quote, "every act of comprehension involves one's knowledge of the world as well." Thus, readers develop a coherent interpretation of text through the interactive process of combining textual information with the information a reader brings to the text. The reading process therefore involves identification of genre, formal structure, and topic, all of which activate schemata and allows readers to comprehend the text. In this, it is assumed that readers not only possess all the relevant schemata, but also that these schemata are now actually activated. Where this is not the case, then some disruption of comprehension may occur. Ibrahim, 2006, states that schema is applied by researchers in different fields, For instance, it is applied in understanding and remembering stories, problem solving, reading comprehension, intercultural communication, and instructional design. Wei He, Jun, and Xiao Hui, 2007, mentioned 3 kinds of schema: linguistic schema, formal schemata, and content schemata. Firstly, a linguistic schema is the reader's existing language proficiency of vocabulary, grammar, idioms. As they suggest, the linguistic schema are the principle of other schemata. Besides linguistic knowledge, it is important to understand the text. Without linguistic schemata, the reader cannot decode or comprehend the text. A second kind of schema is formal schemata. Wei Hui, Jun, and Xiao Hui, 2007, described formal schemata as the rhetorical structure and organizational form of the text. Formal schemata include knowledge of different types of texts and different text types and genre. Formal schemata are described as abstract and encoded, internalized, coherent patterns of metalinguistic discourse and textual organization that guide expectation in our attempts to understand text. The third kind of schema is content schema. This kind of schemata is the background knowledge of the content area of the text. They include topic familiarity, cultural knowledge, and previous experience with the field. Content schema deal with knowledge relative to the content domain of the text, which is the key to the understanding of text. I move on now to pedagogical implications of the schema theory. As a teacher, it is our job not only to disseminate information, but to do this in a way that is easily understood by the learners. Teachers should make use of any means to facilitate learning and boost learners' self-esteem. One important way of boosting learners' self-esteem is by linking new input to familiar or old knowledge. By linking the students' known knowledge of familiar lexical or grammatical items to new knowledge or information being disseminated, the effective teacher can not only facilitate understanding, but also retention of meaning of new information. Therefore, when selecting texts for reading or listening comprehension, it is advisable to use texts which are in the known schema of the learner, as this facilitates understanding. In addition, when talking to the students, ensure that the language used is in the linguistic schema of the learner. Conclusion. In this presentation, I hope that as a researcher studying language in use in society and noting communication problems or miscommunication that occurs, I believe that as language teachers, we give our learners a sense of pride and identity when they are made to realize that their cultural norms can be used in the nativized Englishes they use. In addition, as teachers, we facilitate learning by making learners aware that they have a range of communication strategies they can use when they face language-related problems. And finally, it is important that teachers link the text, both verbal and textual, to the known schema of their learners, as this facilitates understanding and makes learning easier for the learner. Thank you very much.